Bava Metzia, page 27. We are the Mishnah, 7 lines from the top of the page. The subject of simanim, distinguishing mark, is the key subject of today. Many practical implications and halachot is deriving from our session today. The question of simanim de oraita or de rabbanan, distinguishing mark, is it biblical or rabbinic, is the core part of our discussion today. Here are some examples. Someone walking a large store, retail store, and all of a sudden you discover on the floor, let's say, $300 cash. Who is the owner of that money? It is not as simple as it sounds, like the one who just discovered it, or the owner of the store, or maybe another person. It's based on a back and forth discussion we're going to discover today. And much serious subject is based on what we study already in Tractate Yevamot, page 120, a distinguishing mark that can apply even of the right of women to remarry. As you know, as long as the husband is alive, it's an issue for her to be out of the contract of the marriage commitment between the two partners. The question is, if we do not recognize the deceased, what exactly makes it or breaks it? Let's say if we just see the back of the body, if you see just part of the face, or if you see just some type of distinguishing mark without recognition of the face itself, and more. So the whole idea of distinguishing mark, which called simanim, and most importantly, if it's biblical or rabbinic, it's in our discussion today. So let's start the Mishnah Kedusha, and it's based on the pasuk. The Torah tells us in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, in chapter 22, quote, "You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep wandering and disregard them." So here the Torah tells us, if you discover something belongs to another fellow, you have the obligation to go ahead and pick it up and return, or put out the words that something was found. Now the Torah used the word certain animals, ox, sheep. You shall return to your brother, and so you shall do with his donkey, you should do with his garment, you should do with his every loss of your brother. So if you tell me it's every loss of your brother, why do you need to tell me that it's also the garments? So here is the Mishnah. Af hasimla hayta bichlal kol elu. Since we have already enumerated several items, and especially since we use the term, a general term that said anything, this is every lost item of your brother. Every lost item of your brother, obviously it's included the garment. So why you need to tell me the word garments? So the velama yatzat lehakish elea velomar lecha. So the reason for that is you have to include it in this generalization that one must return all of these items. מס שמלה מיוחדת שיש בה סימנים ויש לה תובעים. אף כל דבר שיש בו סימנים ויש לו תובעים חייב להכריז. So the Mishnah tells us, you derive from here an analogy. And the analogy is the same way as if you have something that carries a distinguishing mark, and it has claimants asserting ownership, and its finder, the one who discovered it, has the obligation to proclaim his fine. The same way, any item concerning which there are a distinguishing mark, and there has claimants asserting ownership, its finder is have the obligation to proclaim his fine. So the chidush here, according to Rabbi Akiva Iger and others, is we have in several places in the Shas, in the Talmud, such as Ketubot, page 12b and more, when you have something that is definite and something that it's not definite, you go by the definite. Bari v'shema, bari adif. So the question is why you need to go. So the beauty Tosfot explained to us that the moment there is a claimant, there is someone who's coming after and search for that, you have this obligation. But if no one come out and ask for that, then you do not have the obligation to return. But let's see much more on this. The Gemara asks a question and over the first part of the Mishnah. They said, Af hasimla ita bichlal kolelu. When we use the garments, that part, the Mishnah said, included of the generalization that one must return. So the question is, Mai bichlal kol elu? What generalization is included? Amar Rava bichlal kol aveidat achicha. When you use the term every lost item of your brother, that's basically incorporate also the clothing. So the Chidush, the Mefarshim said that in the simla, in the garments, is only when it's Yeush, when the owner just in desperation gave up hopes. But then it's a different story. Otherwise there is an obligation. So ask a simple question. Use the word in the Mishnah, ox, based on the Torah, ox, donkey, garment. Why you need all of that? You can say everything. So that's part of that. One of them will be suffice. Tzriche, it's all necessary. Why? The katav rachmana simla. If the Torah just used the term is garment, hava amina, one may say han mile. The obligation to return the lost item applies specifically be'edim de gufa v'simanim begufa. Here, the mitzvah of return the item applies only in the case when the owner brings witnesses capable of testifying about the item itself, or he described distinguishing mark concerning the item itself, such as he bring the garment and you have some specific mark that clearly recognize that they belong to that person. Aval chamo be'edim de'ukaf v'simanim de'ukaf. But when it's come to donkey, remember those days it was a very much use of donkey. So when it's come to donkey, what happened is they have this saddle. So when you have distinguishing mark concerning the saddle and not of the donkey, you say that we not have to return the donkey to the owner. So therefore the Torah said the word chamor, add the word donkey, the afilu chamor besimanei ha'ukaf. That even you have a situation where he described distinguishing marks on the saddle, that suffice to return it. And we don't say maybe he take this saddle from another fellow and put it here, because that's Chotam Sofer and others say that that's very seldom, it's rare, and therefore it's not apply here. So I understand why we need the donkey, but how about others, such as sheep, ox, sheep? Why the Torah needs to specifically say those items? Show the afilu legizat znavo. What happened is when it's come to ox, that even the sheared wool of its tail, in those days is they used to use it, and the big chidush here, according to Rabbeinu Asher, Rashba and others, the big question is if the owner is obligated to go ahead and make an extra effort that part, the tail, will come back again. So that's called occupy yourself, התעסקות בשבח המציאה. Occupy yourself to improve the item that was found. So according to the some of the early sages, that's the novelty, that's the חידוש in the pasuk. ושה לגזיותיו. So the reason the Torah used the word sheep is that one must return even its sheared wool. So the Gemara asks for לכתוב רחמן השור, דאפילו לגזת זנבו, וכל שכן לגזיותיו. So how about if the Torah just mentioned the word ox, and we derive from here that one must return even sheared wool of its tail, and drive for sure that one must return the more substantial sheared wool of a sheep. אלא מרב החמור דבו לרבי יהודה וסד האבדה לדברי הכל. קשיא. So Rava said that when the Torah used the word donkey, that's applied to damage that involved in the category that's called pit. If you remember, we studied in the Bava Kamma and other places that see it in Bava Kamma 54 that when it's come to bo, the v'chi yiftach ish bo, if a person dig a pit, and all of a sudden the Torah said that a donkey or a ox just collapse and get there in Shmot in Exodus 21. So the Torah derived from that all this, the derivative, it's all the damages involved with peat. So that's basically the view of Rabbi Yehuda. And when it's come to a sheep, it's stated when it's come to a lost item according to everyone. And they are difficult because it's no explanation for why they are stated. Tosfot and other Rishonim challenge the whole idea of gizat znavo, the whole idea of tail that have to return. Because obviously we learn the din of shaveh pruta. If they have the value, like shaveh pruta is some basic coin, but basic value, if they have it, so they have the obligation to return. Some say that because the gizat zanav, the shield of the tail, it's part of the ox, that it's worth shaveh pruta, that's carry a value. So it means that if it's something that doesn't carry the basic value of shaveh pruta, minimum, so the big question, if it's together with something that's worth with shaveh pruta, so even that item is not, since it's combined with another one, then you have the obligation to return everything. That's according to Sfot and other Mefarshim. Maybe you said that the word sheep, that comes to teach us the obligation to return the animal's dung. Glalim afkurei mafkaralu. They said when it's come to animal dung, the owner has renounced its ownership. Rashi tells us, למי שטרח בו, ולא עתק רע לרבוי ינהו, דאין לו תובעים הוא. Because it's no one to come out and want it. So there are those who ask a question on this Rashi, should be the opposite way. Because if it's hefker, so it's belongs to everyone. And not only if it's hefker to some, hefker לחלק מהם. So anyway, so they challenge this Rashi. The Gemara offer another explanation. ודילמה לסימנים ודעתה. Maybe, perhaps, when the Torah used the term sheep, that teaches the obligation to return an item based in its owner providing distinguishing mark. Because this is based on the predicament of a quandary, the ibayala. That's something we're going to study on page 27. Simanin de oraita or de rabanan. When it's come to the obligation to identify an item using a distinguishing mark, is that an obligation by our Torah law, or is it by rabbinic law? So they said, Katav Rachmana said, so the Torah said the word sheep, and we derive from here that it's only through the testimony of witnesses, but even based on distinguishing mark, that we return lost item to its owner. ואפילו בסימנים מהדרינן, וסימנים דאורייתא. The derivative from here is the halacha that the item can be identified by using simanim, distinguishing marks, by Torah law. Amrei, the students of the yeshiva rejected that and said, מדקתנא לא הותנא לסימנים גבי סמלה. Since the Tanna mentioned a distinguishing mark when it's come to a garment, דקתנא מהסמלה מיוחדת שיש בה סימנים ויש לה טובים, the special point of garment is they have both. They have a distinguishing mark, and they have people who come and being the one who tovea or claimants to that. Chayav להכריז, is obligated to go and proclaim that he find it. אף כל דבר שיש בו סימנים ויש לו טובים חייב להכריז. Meaning any item that they have both distinguishing mark and claimants, one is have the obligation to proclaim his finding. שממינה דסה לאו בסימנים הוא דעתה. We derive from here that the word sheep does not come to teach the obligation to return an item based on its owner providing distinguishing mark. It was a teshuvah, it was a response of Rabbi Moshe Weisblum, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Was a fellow that traveled to be with his father in one of those vacation place for Pesach. So it was 3 generations. It was the grandpa that paid for the rooms. It was the father and his son. And all of a sudden, under the sofa in that hotel, the grandson discovered an expensive diamond. Now, the question is, what do you have to do here? What do we learn in the Gemara? We learn in a few places that son, samuch al shulchan aviv, is dependent on his father, and therefore it belongs to his father. But in this case, you may say, since the grandfather paid for the vacation, maybe it's his, because kulam somchim al shulchan saba, everyone depend on the grandpa generosity by hosting them. Maybe the previous tenant or the previous person who ran the place needs to return it. Maybe the owner of the hotel has this diamond. So Moshe Weisblum have tshuva based on that, and he is a long responsa because the owner is miyaesh, he's already gave up hope on this. Therefore, based on the Gemara, he asks how you go about. Do you say that it's the one who find it, his father, his grandfather, the owner of the hotel? Anyway, Tanu Rabbanan. As we learn in the book of Dvarim, chapter 22, verse 3, Asher tovad mimenu. The Torah said, quote, and so shall you do with his donkey, and you shall do with his garment, and you shall do with every item lost of your brother, which shall be lost from him. So, what is which shall be lost? פרט לעבדה שאין בה שווה פרוטה. You go by any item, but it's exclusion for a loss of item that carries a value less than 1 pruta, which is due to the negligible value, is not considering lost. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Rabbi Yehuda says, because the Torah said, and which lost him and you found found it, so and you have found it, פרט לאבדה שאין בה שווה פרוטה. That's have here an exclusion, the item which not value of pruta, which is a very basic value. As we said at Machne Ephraim, and you see it also in the Rambam, is a discussion. What do you do if it's a combination of few things that's not shווה pruta, but if you combine them, it's already shווה pruta. My benaihu, what exactly the practical difference between the views? אמר אביי משמעות דורשין איכא בנאיו. Difference is how you derive from the, how do you have the interpretation of that halacha. Mar דתנא קמא נפקא לה מאשר תאמר, Umar, which is Rabbi Yehuda, derives it from mi'umtzata, and you shall find it. So, hu mibayele lich de Ravnai. So, according to the sages, that term is necessary for the derivation, which is the view of Ravnai, and the Bach said Ravina. The Amar Ravina or Ravnai umtzata de'ata lidei mashma. When the Torah used the word umtzata and you found it, that means that item only when it actually enters his possession. So the derivative is, if you have, as we learn, something belongs to idol worshipper, the obligation, the chiyuv, it's not applied. So the Gemara asks, "Uleman de nafkale umtzata." According to Rabbi Yehuda, the first one, that derived halacha that one doesn't need to return a lost item worth less than shve pruta mi umtzata hayasher tovayed ma'avidle. So why he need? What's the derivative he learned from, which shall be lost from him? That's already the way he derived it. So what do you derive from the end? You have find it. Looks like twice. So they said, "Mibayla lech de Rabbi Yochanan." The Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Some said Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak. Minayin לעבודה ששטפה נהר שהיא מותרת. From where we derive that an item that the river swept away, that is permitted for its finder to keep it. שנאמר וכן תעשה לכל עבודת אחיך אשר תאבד ממנה ומצאתה. Torah said that's the way you should do it to every lost item of your brother, which you'll find should be lost from him and you found it. So you derive from here, מי שעבודה ממנו מצויה אצל כל אדם, which is the item that lost from him, the owner, but it's available to be found by any person. יצתה זו שעבודה הימנו ואינה מצויה אצל כל אדם. It's available to, they are excluded to the obligation, lost from him and not available to be found by any person. It is ownerless property, and anyone who finds it can keep it. So Rashi said, because the Torah emphasized, they used the word mimenu, so you derive from that asher tovad, it's like attached to each other. Idach Rabbi Yehuda hay de Ravnai menale. How we derive from the umtzata that doesn't have the obligation to return the lost item of idol worshipper, even if it's in his hand. Nafkalei mi umtzata, because they use the vav, the additional vav, and it's written in the past tense, which means, Rashi explained, it's already hold in his hand. You have it. Vehida harab de Rabbi Yochanan menale. Nafkalei mimenu, derive it from him, which means that it's derive asher tova, that's apply to any lost item that doesn't carry the value of pruta, and mimenu to an item that you have found that the lost in the river. ואידך, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, ממנו לא משמע לי. He does not learn anything from the point, from the word ממנו. So, the Tana Kamma derived from the asher tovad mimeno two things. One, that's asher tovad is not applied to something that does not have the pruta values. Two, mimenu, from him, as Rabbi Yochanan, from him and any other person. The truth of the matter, למעשה, according to Abaye, the machloket of Dorshin, from where we derive the drash, there are Rishonim, you see it even in Achronim, a discussion over a like needle. Sometimes remember those group of needles that you have it in a pocket. So in order to have chiyuv shvuah, the obligation to take an oath, you have to have a shve pruta, you have to have some values. So what do you do with needle or group of needles to put it together? So the argument is that it's carry chashivut, it carries importance, but doesn't have the value of shve pruta. So there are those who say that since they have a kli, since it's a vessel, it's utensil, it's something that you can use, that's enough to impose shvuah. But it's a big discussion if this part of chiyuv of hashavat aveda, because needle it's kli and it's carry chashivut, but it's still not shve pruta. So the Rishonim and Achronim, a discussion how you treat it. It has chashivut, it has kli, but doesn't have the shve pruta. רב אמר פרוטה שהוזלה איכה בניו, מאן דאמר מאשר תובר איכה, ומאן דאמר ומצאתה לאיכה. ולמאן דאמר אשר תובר רבינן מצאתה ולאיכה. So according to one who says that halacha is derived from the phrase which shall be lost from him and would not require the item to be worth one pruta. So because he said have you have found it, so it's not worth the pruta when it's found, so you should agree that it doesn't need to be returned. La pruta shukra ikabenayu. Remember several days ago we talked about stocks that can go below the value of pruta and can go up, down, change. So here is a circumstance like that. The time of the found, when it's discovered, so it doesn't carry pruta. And then all of a sudden it turns to be valuable. So man de'amar, according to Rabbi Yehuda, umtzata ika, he needs to return because it's dependent upon the time of the discovery, and if at that time it's worth pruta, so you have the obligation to declare. Man de'amar, and according to Tana Kamma said asher tovar leika, because go by the time of the discovery, and at that time it wasn't shve pruta. ולמאן דאמר ומצאתה הבאינן אשר תאבד. But according to one who says that the halacha is from there and you find it, will not require the item to be worth one pruta when it's lost. Veleika, it's not worth one pruta when it was lost, so you should agree that it doesn't need to be returned. Ela pruta, the bach, take it out, but anyway, שהוקרא והוזלה וחזרה והוקרא יקרא ביניים. Here we talk about situation that is fluctuated. One pruta that lost that appreciation value, and then it was devalued in the interim and was worth less than one pruta, and then appreciated value and worth one pruta when it's found. So it's ups and down, ups and down. Man דאמר אשר תאבד איכה. So one would say that you can derive it from which is lost. So the Ritva explained that we have here the obligation to return the item because the pasuk, the verse, is referring to its value only when it's lost and then when it's found. Which means that it was value of pruta in both. asher tovad, when it's lost, and it's time to found. Uman damar, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that said that applied to a lost item doesn't carry the pruta. Umtzata ba'inyan de'it ba shi'ur mציעא. So the Ritva explained that Torah required that the time of the discovery should carry the value of shve pruta, mishat aveda at shat mציעא, from the time that it's lost until the time it's finding, as the conjunction and connects the time of the finding and the time of the loss. So the emphasis the Ritva said is the word asher tovad. So according to that view, the Ritva explained, if it was in between time that doesn't carry the pruta, doesn't have the obligation to return, but the Rishonim have a discussion. We said that Yeush shelo midat have Yeush. So if in between it's go below then shve pruta, and we argue and you said that the balabai, the owner, if he knows that in the middle that he doesn't carry pruta, so he give up, he mityaesh, he give up hope. So according to Rava, Yeush shelo midat have Yeush. So the Netivot HaMishpat and the Ktsot HaChoshen have a discussion here, and they bring a very important yesod, a very important point of foundation here. You see it in both, in Netivot HaMishpat and Ktsot HaChoshen. They explain that the hefker and Yeush, tzvei dinim, it's two different things bahalacha. Hifkarta, if it's hefker, yatsa mirshutcha, it's no longer part of your estate. Versus when it's come to Yeush, so therefore someone else can take it over and be zoch and be acquired to that item. If it's Yeush, if you give up hope in desperation, somebody else can have it. But if nobody zachai, nobody acquired it, so that's yours. So Yeush, if it's depart, im yatsa mirshuto, if it's come out of its domain, and again, it's shve pruta at the time of the lost, so that's it. But according to Tana Kamma, if it's still in his domain, b'rshuto shel bal habayit, so you have the obligation to return it, according to Tana Kamma. Therefore, you don't have an issue of the view of Rabbah. But anyway, those who have time, these are Netivot HaMishpat Ktsot HaChoshen that have a lot of hagdarot or definition, and mainly teach us that hefker and Yeush is total two different domain. Ibaya lehu, the sages raised the question, when you say that you allow to go and take the lost item based on distinguishing mark, simanim deoraita or derabanan, is that the basis of distinguishing marks? Is it Torah law or it's rabbinic law? My nafkamina, what difference is there whether it's by Torah law or by rabbinic law? So the Ktsot HaChoshen Reish Nun Tet 259 expand on that. What exactly the definition, why it's in Torah makes a difference. But my nafkamina, what's the difference if we say that it's biblical or rabbinic? Page 27b. Le'ahadure get isha besimanim. The practical difference is in a situation of a get, of bill of divorce, that need to return to the woman by lost or by an angel before its delivery. Iyamalt deoraita mehadrinan. If you tell me that it's a biblical law, we need to return the document and allow the agent to transmit it to the woman. V'yamart derabanan, but if you tell me that it's rabbinic law, we do not return the document. Why? Ki avud rabanan takanta, when the sages institute a enactment, an ordinance, it's only when it's come to what? B'mamona, a monetary manners. Which means the base in Gemara in Gittin 36, that in some cases the sages have the power to take away the estate of a person. אבל באיסורה לו אבוד רבנן תקנת. When it's come to the ritual matters, the sages not institute an ordinance. So, because they have no authority to abrogate the prohibition by Torah law, that are associated with women's material status. So the Rabbi Yehuda brings from his son-in-law, Rabbi Yosef HaTzadik. You see it also in the Chemdat Shlomo, you see in the Chatam Sofer, and many others. They said there's three levels of distinguishing mark. The most effective are clear-cut distinguishing mark, which means you have it a hollow in a bill of divorce alongside with the specific letter. The middle intermediate level is of distinguishing mark. It's the length or the weight on the basis of which the finder returns a lost item to its owner. And the least effective are non-specific distinguishing mark, which is a color or general description of a height, such as tall or short. So that the distinguishing mark, basically most of the rabbis said that they are sufficient by Torah law. Every other halacha require proof that are not specific distinguishing marks and never sufficient. The dispute among the commentaries is in which the intermediary level distinguishing mark, that's sufficient or not. But anyway, the big question is, if you tell me that the simanim d'oraita, how do you know that you can do the get isha, the bill of divorce? The big argument, as we said, Rabbi Yehuda brings from Yosef HaTzadik. You see it's in the Chemdat Shlomo, you see it in the Chatam Sofer. The big thing is, when it's come to it's much chamur, it's a ritual matter, it's much serious. But the mamonot, it's different. You can return the lost item to one who lost it, versus ritual matters. It's chashash harayot, isura. It's much severer than mamona. Anyway, so the Gemara tried to explain based on what we learn now in Mishnah. Tashma, come and hear a proof from the Mishnah. אף הסמלה הייתה בכלל כל אלו, ולמה יצאת להקיש אליה ולומר לך מה סמלה מיוחדת שיש לה סימנים ויש לה תובעים, חייב להכריז. כל דבר שיש לו סימנים ויש לו תובעים חייב להכריז. So, because we have this statement of generalization that the simla, the point of the statement of clothing within the text was specifically mentioned within there, which means they said donkey, ox, and then they said simla. So the garment, the simla, it's come to teach us that they to draw an analogy and to say to you what is notable about simla, about a garment, that there are distinguishing mark concerning it, and it was a claimant's asserting ownership, and its finder is obligated to proclaim his find the same way as any concerning which are distinguishing mark, and its claimant asserting ownership, the finder is obligated to declare. So what do you derive from that? That simanim d'oraita, that distinguishing mark is biblical. So the Gemara rejected it and said no. Tana tov'in itzrich alei. The Tana mentioned that only to speak about the claimants, meaning if is no one out to come and claim for that item, which means is Yeush Be'alim, the owner already gave up hope in despair, you have no obligation to return it, and that's a derivative from the word garment, simla. Simanim k'di nasva, the distinguishing marks for no reason, which means by the way that the Torah law distinguishing marks is not a relevant factor. And Rashi tells us בלא מקרא, אלא אסמכים נוקרא בעלמא. So according to the statement here in Rashi, it's smach, it's remez, that's Rabbeinu Peretz and Shita Mekubezet. It's Tosfot have a different view. Anyway, Tashma. Chamor b'simaneh ukaf. We said a donkey is basically a distinguishing mark of the saddle. Eima ba'adei ukaf, the witness that testified that the identity of the owner based on the fact that the saddle belongs to him, and not by the basis of the distinguishing mark. Third proof, Tashma. The Torah said in Varim 22, when you have a situation that the owner is unknown to the finer, they said, "Ve'aya imcha rosh achicha oto." Should be with you until your brother claims. So the question is, do you think that the fellow will go and give it to him before he claims it? How can the finer return it if he does not know the identity of the owner? Ela dorsheu im ramayu or ena ramayu. You have to check if it's a swindler or not, which means only when you check it, then you return it, which means you have to leave doctor, you have to check it very carefully. Maram Shif, the Malbim also, the Malbim on the Torah, beautifully, they said, Oto, it's a siman. Marsha and the big Malach here that said that's proof that simanim the Rabbanan, but anyway, Ma'ila b'simanim lo b'ediyim. So it's not a distinguishing mark, it's a basis of the scrutinizing their witnesses. Now the Gemara try to prove that simanim is not the oraita from something that we learn in Masechet Yevamot, page 120. This is very serious and very painful. I have a situation, as we learn in Yevamot, to have a teraguna if a wife cannot get married or cannot release from the marriage while the husband is no longer among the living, or at least unknown. So we have to find a distinguishing mark on the body. So the question is how you recognize the body, what exactly items. So the more than I encourage you and urge you to see the shiur on Yevamot 120. But anyway, they said, En meidim ela al partzuf hapanim im achotem. The only way we take the testify of the witnesses is when they see the countenance, which is the face with the nose. So all, as this one allows one to identify the individual with certainty. Now, people who involved with this, my experiences in IDF and others, can tell you that it's hard sometimes. There's a special unit in the IDF rabbinate dealing with Zirui Chaluli. My son-in-law is very involved with this, and the problem is when you have eye or mouth, it's not sufficient. You go by the nose, you go by the way you recognize the face. The Eben Ezer Yudzayin Chelkat Mekokek expand on that, and you see also in the big writing in the Gesher Chaim for late Rav Tov Kuczynski. But anyway, even though there are distinguishing marks on his body and his garment, which appear to indicate his identity, they cannot be used to identify the person. You have the reading here that it's not the right. It's Amrei gufo de'aroch v'gutz kelav v'chashin l'she'ela. So here you have a situation that can be a body that is that was tall or short. So that's the reason that distinguishing marks are ineffective to determine his identity, or we're concerned about loan, which means that the husband loaned his clothes to the deceased. So so why we turn with the saddle, the donkey? Usually people don't borrow the saddle. Again, that's those days, the saddle, they are not custom fit. The donkey. It's come to garments, there's a white or red, there's the reason that distinguishing marks are ineffective to determine the identity. Find the get It was lost and bound in pouch or in person's signet ring, או שמצאו בין כליו, we found it among his garment, אפילו לזמן מרובה כאשר, if it's a long time, it's valid. ויסגל הדחך שינו לשאלה, כי מצאו קשור בכיס, המאי כאשר, נחוש לי שאלה, we should be concerned that there's a possibility that this is a loan, that the pouch and the get belong to someone else. אמרי כיס ורנקי וטבעת לו משל לאינשי. This is something uncommon for people to just borrow. כיס וארנקי משום דמסמנה וטבעת משום דמזייף. It can be a forge of document. למה כתנאי מדין לשומה? ולעזר בן מהווי אומר מעידים על השומה. מה אליו? בהקמי פליגי לתנא קמא סבר סימנים דרבנן. ולעזר בן מהווי סבר סימנים דאורייתא. מרב הרב rejected that said לכולם סימנים דאורייתא ואחר בשום המסויה בבן גילו כמפלגי. במחלוקת תנאים here, it's the distinguishing mark is found on the one born under the same constellation, rendering it useless is a mean of identification. מר סבר, the first Tana holds, שומה מצויה בבן גילו, ומר סבר שומה אינה מצויה בגילו. הביתה עם הליכולי עלמא, שומה אינה מצויה בבן גילו, ואחר בסימנים עשויים להשתנות לאחר מיתה כמפלגי. Here the מחלוקת is that if distinguishing mark can be changed after a person is no longer among the living. מר סבר הסימנים עשויים להשתנות לאחר מיתה. לאחר מיתה ומר סבר סימנים אין השתונים לאחר מיתה. So the other one said the distinguishing mark is not apt to change after death. So therefore it's sufficient as a mean of identification. הבאתם הדחולי עלמא, שומה אינה עשויה לשנות לאחר מיתה. Everyone agreed that the mole is not apt to change after death. וסימנים דרבנן, distinguishing mark is rabbinic law. ואחר בשומה סימן מובהק הוא כמפלגי. So now the מחלוקת is in a mute, a clear cut distinguishing mark. מר סבר שומה סימן מובהק הוא, וסמר סבר שומה לא שומה מובהק. It's a big question if the mole it's a סימן מובהק, it's a clear cut distinguishing mark. The other one said that it's not. So since standard distinguishing marks are sufficient by the Rabbanon, by rabbinic law, a marriage which is in effect by Torah law cannot be dissolved on the basis of just a mole. So it means that we have three types of distinguishing mark. We have siman muvak, something that's clear cut, such as a document that he put a hole with next to the certain words. Second one, the length of the item, and now the thing is the color or heights. But more on that is the Magid Mishnah and the Rambam in Chok Zelav Avedat, chapter 13.